Der französische Präsident Emmanuel Macron hat jüngst seine Forderungen nach einer Entsendung von NATO-Bodentruppen in die Ukraine erneuert. Er gab dafür sogar einen möglichen völkerrechtlichen Rahmen vor, eine Bitte der ukrainischen Regierung. Die Ukraine signalisierte prompt ihre Bereitschaft dazu, wenn die Zeit dafür gekommen sei. Großbritannien, die Slowakei und Ungarn haben eine Entsendung von Soldaten strikt ausgeschlossen. Und auch die NATO-Führung steht dieser Idee laut Medienberichten ablehnend gegenüber. Am Mittwoch jedoch signalisierte das NATO-Mitglied Litauen, dass es bereit sei, seine Soldaten in die Ukraine zu entsenden. Was sagst du zu den Forderungen nach NATO-Bodentruppen in der Ukraine? Ist das wirklich ein Szenario, das Nationen wie Frankreich und Litauen durchführen werden? Mit oder ohne Einwilligung der NATO? Und wäre eine Einladung der ukrainischen Regierung ein legitimer Rahmen dafür?
I think first of all we have to understand that the concept of legality is irrelevant in this setting. Russia has made it clear that it has red lines and that it will not tolerate the intervention by NATO into what it views as a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I believe Russia summoned the French ambassador to the foreign ministry in Moscow. We're not, of course, cognizant of what exactly he said, but I would imagine that the Russians informed the French in no uncertain terms that should French soldiers be deployed onto Ukrainian soil, not only would they be legitimate targets, but so would the places where those French soldiers came from. That means that Russia is prepared to strike facilities and bases in Romania and possibly even France. At the same time, Russia summoned, and they also summoned the British ambassador and reminded him that while England may not be wanting to send troops to Ukraine, England did greenlight Ukrainian use of Storm Shadow missiles to strike strategic targets inside Russia. And I believe the Russians also told the British that if this happens, they will hold the British accountable and they will strike British targets outside of Ukraine up to and including targets on the British islands. And the Russians made it clear, I also believe, that they aren't bluffing, that the decisions have already been made. There will be no discussion. It will just happen. And at that point in time, NATO will have to, decide, having told the French don't deploy, do the French now get to cloak themselves in Article 5 protection? The same thing with the British, having been warned not to do this, are the British able to cloak themselves in Article 5 protection? Russia has long said that any decision by NATO to invoke Article 5 and engender a broader Russian-NATO conflict could trigger the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. And when they use nuclear weapons, it wouldn't be against forces in Ukraine. It would be used to strike decision-making centers throughout Europe. Russia announced that they will be exercising their tactical nuclear capability in the Southern Military District, which is one of the key military districts supporting the special military operation. And again, the Russian president has made it clear that the decision to use these weapons per the doctrine of Russia has already been made, that there won't be discussion, that it will happen. So this is a very dangerous situation. Hopefully after being summoned to the foreign ministry, neither the French nor the British can delude themselves into believing that the Russians are bluffing. The question can those ambassadors impart not just the content, but the tone of the Russian warnings to their respective leaderships, and will they make the appropriate decisions? We have yet to see. Clearly, Lithuania, whose ambassador wasn't summoned, somehow thinks that the Russians are bluffing. Hopefully, the French don't believe the Russians are bluffing. Hopefully, the French understand that the Russians are very serious about this, and the Russians will take the appropriate action. Ukraine no longer gets a vote. I think that's something everybody else has to understand too. The Russians have made a decision to transition from what they call the active defense phase into the offensive phase. This is a statement made by Defense Minister Shoigu. by going over on the offensive, Russia's committing to decisive actions that are designed to complete the destruction of the Ukrainian military and occupy, additional territories. Russia has long said that one of the conditions for bringing this war to an end is the creation of a buffer zone that will protect Russian territory from any attacks by residual Ukrainian forces. So Russia, I believe, is in the process of not only recapturing Russian territory in the Donbass and Zaporizhia and Kherson, but also will extend their operations. So at a minimum, they create a buffer zone, but at a maximum, they may make the decision to take Odessa and take Kharkov. The French have indicated that they would be willing to intervene to save Odessa. But there's no amount of justification the French can come up with, whether it's legitimate under international law or otherwise, that will prevent Russia from viewing any French intervention as an existential threat, and that Russia will react accordingly.
Womöglich als Reaktion auf die anhaltenden Provokationen seitens Frankreich und anderer NATO-Mitglieder demonstrierte Russland am Montag die Bereitschaft seiner nuklearen Streitkräfte, insbesondere seiner taktischen Atomsprengköpfe. Dienstag zog auch Weißrussland nach und probte den Einsatz nuklearer Waffen. Der weißrussische Präsident Alexander Lukaschenko betonte in einer Ansprache, dass die Schwelle zum Atomkrieg noch nie so nah gewesen sei wie heute. Wie schätzt du das aktuelle Risiko eines atomaren Krieges ein? In welchen Formen könnte ein möglicher Atomkrieg ablaufen? Wie würde der Einsatz russischer und weißrussischer taktischer Atomwaffen aussehen?
I think it's essential to point out that Russia doesn't believe in a limited nuclear war. They don't have a doctrine that supports that. A war could start out with the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but Russia would be prepared to escalate immediately to a general nuclear exchange. And so I think it's important for people to understand that all the tactical nuclear weapons do is give Russia a range of options in a battlefield situation. It doesn't require the use of a 150 kiloton weapon. But it doesn't mean that Russia wants to limit this war, that Russia is ready to limit this war. If Russia uses nuclear weapons, it'll be part of a overarching plan of general nuclear war between Russia and the adversary, which in this case would be NATO. And if the United States wanted to join in, to include the United States. The targets that would be struck would be targets that involve the accumulation of military forces, decision-making centers, both in terms of military headquarters in the field and civilian decision-making centers. This means that national capitals would be struck, major industrial facilities would be struck, major port facilities would be struck. It would be catastrophic for Europe. It would be the end of Europe. And again, this is why Russia continuously reminds people of their doctrine and of the importance of respecting Russian red lines. Russia's not bluffing. They're exercising these nuclear forces to send a signal to the West that Russia's ready to use them. And as Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly, all the decisions have been made. There will be no talking. That if NATO insists on crossing red lines that Russia has clearly laid out, and again, I think Russia summoning the British and the French ambassadors reiterates this point. I would like to believe that Russia read them the riot act and told them exactly what the consequences of their actions would be, and reminded them that this is not a bluff. So hopefully they informed people of that. But I'm also hopeful that the respective military and intelligence services of these nations, of all nations, would impress upon their respective leadership that Russia doesn't engage in limited nuclear warfare, that any use of tactical nuclear weapons would be part of a larger nuclear war plan that would involve a general nuclear exchange that would lead to the destruction of humanity as we know it.
Sowohl die Europäische Union als auch die NATO scheinen durch den Ukraine-Krieg vor eine Zerreißprobe gestellt zu werden. Die uneingeschränkte Unterstützung für Kiew und nun die aggressive Forderung nach NATO-Bodentruppen in der Ukraine lassen insbesondere in der Slowakei und Ungarn Zweifel hochkommen, ob EU und NATO wirklich der beste internationale Rahmen für diese Länder sind. Und auch aus der Türkei werden Stimmen lauter, dass die NATO zu einer Gefahr für die türkische Souveränität und auch die nationale Sicherheit wird. Eine mögliche Wahl von Donald Trump zum US-Präsidenten und damit verbunden rasant steigende finanzielle Forderungen aus Washington könnte womöglich ein letzter Nadelstich sein und zu einem Auseinanderbrechen der NATO führen. Welche Zukunft siehst du für die NATO? Welche Szenarien gibt es für eine Auflösung der Militärallianz?
I personally don't see any future for NATO. I believe that NATO is over, it's finished. It's a derelict, entity that has long outlived its usefulness, and no longer has a legitimate purpose, and as a result, has become an extension of American national security prerogatives, which require a continual state of war. Remember the military-industrial congressional complex that Dwight D. Eisenhower warned the American people and indeed the world about in his farewell address in 1961, exists. It's a reality. One only has to parse away the statements made by various U.S. lawmakers when talking about the recent $60.1 billion supplemental aid package for Ukraine, where they said, well, 48 billion of this is coming back to America. This is good for American jobs. This is good for American business. What they're saying is that America needs war in order to economically thrive. That America is a parasitic nation attached to the globe that needs to suck the world dry of life in order to continue to thrive and grow. That's the American model, and NATO has allowed itself to become an extension of that. And we see this in Ukraine, where tragically NATO and the United States have said they're willing to let the Ukrainians fight to the last Ukrainian. And what does this say about NATO? What does NATO stand for? And the other thing is that because NATO is linked to the European Union, NATO is linked to the decision by Europe to sanction Russia. And the economic consequences of the sanctioning of Russia have blown back on the European Union. That which they wanted to have happen to Russia has happened to them with constricting economies, deindustrialization. There's a lot of talk in NATO today about the need to remilitarize, to build new weapons, to rearm. But with what industry? Their industry has collapsed. They don't have an industry to do this. And if Donald Trump is elected president and he puts more demands on Europe, Europe can't meet these demands. They're unrealistic for Europe to meet without, their literal economic destruction. And so, this is a pact with the devil that NATO has made. The devil being the United States, and now the bill's coming due, and they can't afford it. And nations are starting to question whether or not this indeed is the direction they want to head. The NATO sort of fooled itself into believing of its in its continued relevance by expanding to include Sweden and Finland. But mark my words, as soon as the bill comes due in both Sweden and Finland, you're going to hear a cry amongst the people saying, "We didn't ask for this. This isn't what we wanted." And then suddenly they're going to have a longing and yearning for diplomacy to try and improve relations with Russia, so they don't have to rearm in a suicidal fashion. Because, as the Russians have pointed out, the concept of a general war with NATO, all this talk about building up 300,000 men, building new tanks and all that stuff, it's predicated on a conventional conflict with Russia that what Russia isn't going to engage in. Russia is not going to engage in a conventional battle with the totality of NATO's military strength. The moment NATO threatens Russia's existential survival, Russia will destroy NATO with nuclear weapons. And in there, Russia has unquestioned supremacy. So there's nothing NATO can do just to stop this outcome. I think as the reality of NATO becomes apparent to all of their members, you're going to see deep fractures take place. You're going to see nations drop off. And I believe that once one nation opts out of NATO, you're going to see a domino effect, and many nations will opt out of NATO, to the point where at the end of the day, probably it will be the United States, Poland, the Czech Republic, and the 3 Baltic states standing together against Russia. Everybody else would have said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with this.
Sagen wir, du wärst nationaler Sicherheitsberater in Ungarn oder in der Türkei. Welche konkreten Ratschläge würdest du der ungarischen oder türkischen Regierung geben über den Verbleib oder den Austritt aus der NATO? Sollten diese Länder zuerst eine sicherheitspolitische Vereinbarung mit den Widersachern der NATO treffen, etwa mit Russland oder China?
Well, my advice would be to start de-emphasizing military alliances. I would not advise to precipitously withdraw from NATO, because that if you withdraw from NATO, you can trigger a negative reaction by NATO members that might manifest itself in terms of economic sanctions, political isolation. If you don't have a plan B in place, that could put you in difficulty. But if you're going to make the strategic decision to distance yourself from NATO, I would advise both Hungary and Turkey to start reaching out to the BRICS forum, to start creating relationships with the BRICS nations, relationships that protect either nation economically from sanctions. For Hungary, I would also be actively supporting a Russian victory in Ukraine, because the key thing for Hungary is to get a common border with Russia or a pro-Russian proxy. And if Ukraine and if Hungary can have a border with a pro-Russia Ukraine, now Hungary has a literal land-based lifeline leading to Russia and the Trans-Eurasian Economic Union, to the Shanghai Cooperation, to BRICS. And now Hungary can talk about joining the BRICS forum without any fear of being physically isolated from Europe. And that could lead other things to happen. For instance, Serbia making a decision to join, Slovakia making a decision to join. And once that happens, you're going to see other nations weighing their options and saying it makes no sense to stay in this NATO, this dead, moribund body that we call NATO. But I think BRICS is the future. It's going to be a viable forum. It will have institutions that rival or exceed the institution of the Group of 7 nations, the Group of 20 nations. It will have economic potential that'll be unmatched by anything the West can bring to bear. And it also de-emphasizes the military solution, so to speak, because the military solution has never solved anything. It simply perpetuates war, which, again, the American military-industrial complex needs to survive. Opting out of NATO means you opt out of allowing your country to become the meat in the meat grinder that feeds the American military machine.
Und Deutschland? Welche Perspektiven siehst du für Deutschland innerhalb oder außerhalb der NATO? Welche konkreten Schritte müsste Deutschland einleiten, wenn es die NATO verlassen wollte? Ist es für Deutschland schwieriger, die NATO zu verlassen, als beispielsweise für Ungarn oder die Türkei?
First of all, politically, it'll be very difficult for Germany to leave NATO, because Germany has been an important part of NATO conceptually and practically from the very beginning. If you remember, Lord Hastings, the first civilian or the first Secretary General of NATO, when asked, what is the mission of NATO, he said it's to keep the Americans in, keep the Germans down, and keep the Russians out. So Germany is always factored in. Now Germany hasn't been kept down. We've reunified Germany, which sort of, and Russians are out, and United States, under Donald Trump, may not want in. So we have a situation where NATO is going through an identity crisis, but the Germans also have, I think, a hangover from the occupation days when they were an occupied, nation torn in two, east and west. Even though they're unified today, it wasn't so long ago that it was a divided nation. And the psychology of the occupied continues because of the continued presence of American troops on German soil. So it would be very difficult for Germany, both from a national psychological perspective and from a historical perspective, to walk away from NATO. But at some point in time, Germany has to weigh in its own best interests. Again, I remind the German people that the United States attacked you when we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. We attacked critical infrastructure, and we have contributed to the a collection of events that have, in their totality, devastated your economy. We've declared economic warfare against you. Um, we seek to use you to, sustain the unsustainable fight that's going on in Ukraine. We don't seem to care about your economic future. We don't care about anything other than your ability to immediately um, fulfill our demands and our expectations. Um, is this the future that Germany wants? And I think the answer is probably no. It's definitely not the future that Germany deserves. But how would Germany go about divorcing itself? I think the first thing that Germany would need to do is take control of the European Union and confront the European Union with literally the notion of my way or the highway, meaning that German economic policy will be insisted upon. And the alternative, if France and Italy and others opt not to do this, is that Germany withdraws from the single currency and goes back to the mark, which will become a very strong currency that it'll lead to the collapse of the euro. And at that point in time, Germany now has created economic chaos that, again, I think would allow the German people to conceive of a withdrawal from NATO. This can be done together with diplomatic outreach to Russia, getting Russia to put in, to open up what's left of the Nord Stream pipeline, to repair the existing, the remnants of the pipeline, to get cheap energy flowing in, and then to tie Germany into this large market. I mean, German automobile manufacturers only are surviving today because of their the business they're doing in China. And China is an important part of the BRICS forum. Russia is a part of that too. I think if Russia could lure Germany away from the G7, from the insanity of American-driven politics and policies, that Germany could find a home in BRICS. But that's what it would take. Germany's not just going to jump off the NATO European Union bandwagon. There has to be something to jump onto. And so far, Germany hasn't made any, discernible, viable efforts in that direction. So in the near term, I don't think you're going to see Germany making a move to leave NATO. But again, at the end of the day, it's the economy that matters most. That's the thing that most elections, revolve around, and German politicians know this reality. And I think over time, you're going to see pressure being put on the German politicians to walk away from American-driven policies that are only bringing harm to Germany economically and in terms of the quality of life of its people, and maybe to once again look to Russia for their salvation.
Sowohl Ungarn als auch Russland haben unabhängig voneinander bereits von der Notwendigkeit zur Schaffung einer europaumspannenden oder sogar eurasischen Sicherheitsarchitektur gesprochen, die dann sogar China mit einbeziehen würde. Explizit nicht mit einbezogen werden dabei die USA. Welche Perspektiven siehst du für die Etablierung eines solchen Sicherheitsrahmens? Könnte er ein Auseinanderbrechen der NATO kompensieren? Und welche Aspekte müsste er auf jeden Fall beinhalten?
If you're looking to replace NATO with NATO, meaning a similar military organization, then there's no prospect of this whatsoever. Hungary and other European nations would be attracted to such an arrangement because, frankly speaking, it would allow Hungary to be plugged in directly to an overarching European Eurasian, economic complex or union that feeds into this massive Chinese economy. That's what would benefit Russia. I think the solution for Europe going forward is not militarization. That's why NATO will never survive, because all it's about is militarization. The solution is economic reform, which leads to societal reforms. And the best path towards achieving meaningful economic reform is for Europe to pivot back to Russia/China and the BRICS Forum and the European or the Eurasian Economic Union. This is the direction. So I think if Hungary could be shown that by joining this, there will be economic prosperity, guaranteed, sanctions proof. That would be a very tempting thing for Hungary, because they're literally getting nothing out of the current relationship with the EU or with NATO. It's just causing them more and more difficulties.
Abschließend bleibt zu fragen, wie würden die USA auf ein Zusammenbrechen der NATO reagieren? Können sie ihre Alliierten zwingen, weiterhin im Bündnis zu bleiben? Und welche Strategie würden die USA auffahren, um einer neuen europäischen oder gar eurasischen Sicherheitsarchitektur zu begegnen?
I just want to remind your audience that the United States is currently withdrawing 1,100 troops from Niger after a 12-year partnership with the Niger government that involved building a $100+ million air base in the center of Niger. The United States has been compelled to withdraw because the government of Niger has said that the United States is no longer welcome there. The United States resisted this for weeks, but when Niger cut off the diplomatic flights that would bring supplies and allow rotation of personnel, thereby isolating the Americans in Niger, the position became unsustainable, and the United States now has agreed to a total withdrawal. That's how the United States behaves. And when the United States tried to put pressure on the Niger government, they were confronted with the fact that the Niger government had not only pivoted away from the West, but had pivoted directly into the arms of Russia, which immediately provided security assistance. And this has created a situation where Russia is dominating a region that the United States used to be dominant in. The United States isn't going to war over this. The United States isn't, drawing its own red lines. They're withdrawing. I personally believe that the United States would do everything in its power to keep NATO viable. But at some point in time, you can't force nations to be what you want them to be. At the end of the day, nations are sovereign states, and they will act in their own, best interest. The fiction of the European Union and a singular policy is just that, fiction. To be honest, the European Union brings very little to bear when it comes to foreign policy and economic policy. It's the policy of the big three, of the Germans, the French, the Italians, that drive European economic policy and, frankly speaking, European security policy. So the collapse of NATO is not the United States will have to deal with the inevitability of the collapse of NATO. I think that's clear. And what will happen is the United States will seek to transition away from this multipolar singularity called NATO, and go back to the business of bilateral agreements. And they may find a situation where some of these bilateral agreements can be, codified as joint security arrangements between multiple nations in Europe. But I believe that NATO is going to collapse. I think the United States can't stop it. And so the next best thing for the United States is to reach out to like-minded nations and maintain some sort of a new bilateral security arrangement. But understand that as nations collapse, that means they're going to be walking away from current, anti-Russian focused policy of Europe, and probably embracing a policy that, while maybe not making direct peace with Russia, allows Russia to serve as a conduit for their access to the Chinese economic miracle. It's going to be the Chinese economic engagement that Europe is going to end up saving Europe more than anything else.